Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, bringing you this week's edition of Hotspot of the Week. And today I want to do something a little bit different. I want to speak about the correlation between economies and real estate markets, specifically about what's happening in local economies and how this translates into events in local property markets. So what I have here in front of me is the latest edition of the State of the States reports by CommSec. They're published every quarter. And I've always been struck by the correlations between the rankings of the various states and territories in this report and outcomes in capital city property markets. Basically, over the last 4 or 5 years, the states and territories, in general terms, the rankings change occasionally from one report to the next, which is published quarterly, as I said. But basically, over the last 4 or 5 years, the rankings have been New South Wales 1, Victoria 2, the ACT 3, Tasmania 4, South Australia 5, Queensland 6, Western Australia 7, and 8th and last, the Northern Territory. And it's interesting that events in capital city property markets over that period of time have correlated very strongly with that, with Sydney the strongest property market until recently, Melbourne number 2, the third spot being fought out between Canberra and Hobart. Hobart's overtaken more recently, and then we've got Adelaide, Brisbane, and coming up as the bottom ranked capital city markets over the last few years, the ones where prices have actually been going backwards while Sydney and Melbourne have been going forwards, Perth and Darwin. So it's interesting to look at the latest report from CommSec, the State of the States report for April, published this week, and what it tells us about what's going on in property markets around Australia and what's likely to be happening later this year with property markets, keeping in mind that we don't have one property market. We have many different markets, or lots of different things happening at different parts of the country. Right now, there are markets in Australia that are rising very strongly, others that are rising moderately, some that are stagnating, some that are dropping a little, and some that are dropping quite fast. And that's the norm for real estate in Australia. It's very, very rare that we have a situation where the whole of the country is doing the same thing at the same time. It almost never happens. In fact, I have a chart on my wall here in my office which shows annual price growth in the major cities of Australia, city by city, year by year, for the last 50 years. And it shows there's only been 4 years out of the last 50 years in which all the major cities have done the same thing at the same time. They're all doing their own thing, dictated by local economic conditions. So the new report out from CommSec shows that Victoria and New South Wales are now ranked equal first. According to their ranking system, what they do is they rank each of the states and territories according to certain criteria, whether it be dwelling starts, economic growth, population, outcomes, retail spending, and they come up, they've got a complex formula that comes up with a ranking system, and right now Victoria and New South Wales ranked number 1. Now, where that's significant for real estate, given that the markets in Sydney and Melbourne are no longer rising strongly, and most parts of those two cities, prices are now in some state of decline, because I believe both those markets hit an affordability wall. Most of the pent-up demand and investor demand was satisfied, and gradually demand weakened, and that process was exacerbated by a tightening of credit and other factors happening out there. But where the strength of those two state economies, New South Wales and Victoria, are jointly ranked first, according to the latest edition of the CommSec State of the States report, is that the markets in the regions of both those states are very, very strong at the moment. My belief is that the strongest market in Australia right now is regional Victoria. And it's significant that that has emerged at a time when Victoria has risen from the number 2 spot in terms of an economic ranking, and is now challenging New South Wales for the spot of the strongest economy in the country. Victoria ranks first on economic growth, also ranks first on retail trade, the jobs market, and the construction work that's been done. So on a number of the key criteria, Victoria ranks number 1. And despite the fact that the Melbourne market has passed its peak and at least some parts of the Melbourne market are winding down, the outer ring areas are still pretty strong. But regional Victoria is where we're seeing the growth in property markets. Cities like Geelong have been very strong, Ballarat is strong, Bendigo is strong, but right across regional Victoria, there are towns and regional centres where prices are rising and rising strongly. New South Wales region's also very strong. In fact, the recent suburb by suburb analysis I did for towns and suburbs of regional cities right across regional New South Wales found that 85% of those locations currently have rising prices. Quite different from the rhetoric we're hearing from the media, isn't it? Where they keep telling us that prices are falling, or in some cases with some of the more sensationalist media, they're telling us that prices are crashing right across Australia. They're inferring that it's happening everywhere. It simply isn't true. What our research shows is that most Australians live in locations where prices are rising right now, not falling. Regional New South Wales is one of them. 85% of locations, according to our town-by-town analysis, have rising prices at the moment, and it's even more strong than that in regional Victoria. Now, the next ranking is where this latest report has ranked the ACT and Tasmania joint third. Previously, ACT was a clear third and Tasmania fourth, but now they've come in with this latest analysis equal third, and that's significant also for property markets. Tasmania, it may surprise some people to learn, has filled the number 4 spot in the nation for the last couple of years. There's been major improvements in the Tasmanian economy, thanks in part to a proactive state government. Many parts of that economy have been strong, population growth has returned, and out of that has come a booming market in Hobart, which right now is the number 1 property market in capital city Australia, but regional Tasmania is incredibly strong. When we did our suburb by suburb, town by town analysis most recently for Tasmania, we couldn't find any locations where prices are falling. Virtually every location in regional Tasmania, as well as Hobart, have prices not only rising but rising strongly, and that's still the case. So it's not a coincidence that the continued elevation of the Tasmanian economy has coincided with booms in not only Hobart but other parts of Tasmania, including Launceston. Now, the ACT has had a consistently strong economy for a long time. It still ranks third alongside Tasmania now. The Canberra property market in many ways presents as a very strong one. Vacancies are very low. Rents are rising more strongly there than in any other capital city in Australia. There's strong activity from buyers. Generally speaking, over the last year or so, prices have been rising, not booming, but Canberra very seldom booms, and it very seldom declines either. It just chugs along very, very steadily, and that's still the case, underpinned by a very, very strong economy. Now, South Australia ranks 5th. That might surprise a few people as well, which means that South Australia ranks higher than Queensland, Western Australia, the Northern Territory. But South Australia is a much stronger economy than most Australians realise, and Adelaide, its capital city, is, I think, the most underrated market in Australia. It has a lot more to offer than most property investors realise. We're now right now doing our suburb by suburb analysis on the latest figures for sales activity and prices for Adelaide, and we haven't finished it yet, so I can't give you the final figures, but Adelaide continues to be very strong. One of the things that stands out for me is the remarkable consistency of this market. Suburb after suburb just has these incredibly consistent numbers in terms of sales activity and also steady price growth. Most of the suburbs of Adelaide, I've got the partial results sitting here in front of me. The vast majority of the suburbs of Adelaide have prices that are higher in terms of median prices than they were 12 months ago, and most of them, or many of them, have risen by more than 5%, and a lot of them by more than 10%. You're not getting that message from the generalised data that's published in media. the research firms like CoreLogic or Domain will publish one figure for the entire city, and it will say that Adelaide prices have risen 1 or 2%. Well, it's very, very misleading, because behind that generalised figure, we have a situation where different parts of the Adelaide market are rising a lot more strongly than that. That's the case for other cities. Brisbane, 68% of Brisbane suburbs have rising prices, according to that analysis that we've completed recently. In Perth, where the generalised figure is still a negative for Perth, but our suburb by suburb study has shown that 40% of the suburbs in Perth have median prices now that are higher than 12 months ago. We still have 60% that are down a little, mostly not much, just a little. But the fact that 40% of Perth suburbs have rising prices does say something about recovery in that market. But Adelaide, South Australia, the 5th ranked economy, I think it's going to rise up the ranking as it goes forwards, because it's definitely, undoubtedly, the high-tech innovation capital of Australia, and there's some big things happening in the South Australian economy and the Adelaide economy because of that. Queensland is still in 6th position. It's a little bit like the Brisbane property market. I described Brisbane's property market recently as like a car that's revving, trying to go forward, but it can't because the handbrake's on. Brisbane's kind of poised to take off as a property market, but the underlying economy is still a bit lukewarm. Relative economic growth has improved in Queensland, according to the CommSec report. It's also ranks 4th on dwelling starts, but generally it's down the rankings for most of the key indicators. And it's one of the things that's been missing in Queensland or in Brisbane that was very, very evident in both Sydney and Melbourne, and a big contributor to their property booms is infrastructure spending. That's starting to change, and I'm hopeful that that will be pivotal in driving the Brisbane market forward. But as I say, the generalised figures show that there's not much growth happening in Brisbane, but when you look behind that figure and do a more detailed analysis, you find that 68% of Brisbane suburbs in the last 12 months have had some sort of growth. Western Australia is starting to improve, according to the CommSec report. Its annual population growth is now the strongest it's been in 3 years. That's a sign of gradual recovery in the Western Australian economy as the resources sector picks up. And that's starting to be reflected in the Perth market, where we're seeing vacancies much lower than they were, rents starting to rise again, sales activity is rising steadily, and we're starting to see a return to smallish price growth. As I said, 40% of the suburbs with median prices higher than 12 months ago. Not a lot higher, but moving in the right direction. And finally, 8th and last, the Northern Territory, a bit of a basket case economy at the moment. It had a boom when the resources sector was raging, and it had big projects like the INPEX gas project happening in Darwin. But since the construction of that project was completed, there's been nothing major to replace it in Darwin and the Northern Territory, nothing of that magnitude at least. And it's very much a languishing economy. Recent figures from the ABS showed that Darwin is the only major city in Australia to actually lose population in the last 12 months, which is another symptom of the state of play in Darwin and the Northern Territory, and its property market continues to languish with prices still falling and rents still falling. And it's a little bit hard to see where the bottom of the market is going to be felt. Something big needs to happen in the economy of the Northern Territory to drag it out of the doldrums. But according to the CommSec report, it certainly hasn't happened yet, and the Northern Territory continues to languish as 8th and last in the State of the States report. So just repeating, the central theme of tonight's broadcast is that property markets very much derive from what's happening with local economies. It's not so much about national factors. That's why I think the outcome of the federal election in many ways is immaterial to property markets around Australia. I know the Labor Party has policies that would impact on investment, but nevertheless it's more to do with local economies And we've seen that with the differences in the outcomes of the capital city markets and the regional markets around Australia, where the strongest capital cities have been Sydney and Melbourne, and right now the strongest markets anywhere in Australia are the regional markets of Victoria and New South Wales, with Tasmanian markets also very strong as a consequence of the steady rise of Tasmania up the rankings, now ranked third, joint third in the nation. Okay, that's it for now. That's Hotspot of the Week, a slightly different twist on it than we normally do, but I hope you found that sort of information useful in helping you decide where you might buy the next time you do so in real estate. Okay, let's do it again, same time next week, and don't forget around lunchtime on Thursday, I usually do my weekly broadcast called The War on Misinformation. And on Wednesday evening next week, we'll be doing our monthly live Q&A, which is always really popular with people out there with questions about real estate, particularly about location. So please tune in for that. Okay, bye for now.